I'm sorry to have arrived a little late. I was recalling an incident that happened in the 18th century. Two friends in London, opposite the Theatre Royal in Drury Lane, had a bet. One said to the other, "I bet you that we could announce that something utterly incredible and impossible was going to happen in Drury Lane Theatre, and that enough people would be sufficiently foolish to come along and see this impossible event." So they took the bet on, and they hired the theatre for one evening, and they said, "On such and such a day at 7:30 p.m. in the Theatre Royal, Drury Lane, a gentleman of quality will get inside a beer bottle, and while inside the beer bottle he will sing all 5 verses of the national anthem, as well as other patriotic songs. And any member of the audience may come along and examine the bottle while he is inside it." This was duly announced in placards throughout London, and all the tickets were sold out. So evidently the person won his bet that there would be enough fools to come along and see something that was manifestly impossible. Well, what happened was they all arrived at the due time at Drury Lane Theatre, and there on the stage there was a table, and on the bare table there was a beer bottle. But no gentleman of quality appeared to get inside the beer bottle. And after a time the audience grew bored with waiting, and so they broke up the furniture in the theatre, and they took it all outside, and they made a great bonfire. Well, I'm glad to say that you haven't yet broken up the furniture and made a bonfire while you were waiting for me. So now I will get inside my beer bottle and sing my little song. In fact, I'm going to give 2 talks. The first lecture will deal with the position of the Orthodox Church in the traditional Orthodox countries, and I have entitled that "Fresh Hope and New Challenges." And the second talk will look at Orthodoxy in the Western world, and there I have given as my title, "Not Ethnic but Global." There is a story, a folk story, retold by the Russian writer Tolstoy, called 3 Questions. The hero in the story has to find out the answer to 3 questions. What is the most important moment? Who is the most important person? What is the most important task? As in all such stories, he has various adventures before he eventually finds out the answer. What is the most important moment? The most important moment is now. The past has gone. You cannot change it. The future is not here as yet. It does not lie in your power. The only moment in time that lies within your power is the present moment, now. And the answer to the other 2 questions is similar. Who is the most important person? It is the person to whom I am speaking now, at this moment. And what is the most important task? It is the task that I am engaged on, here and now. So the moral of that little story retold by Tolstoy is how it is supremely important to dwell in the present moment, maximize the moment. You must seize the kairos, the moment of opportunity, now, today. That is what God says to us. How did Christ begin his public preaching? In St. Luke's Gospel, we are told that he went to the synagogue in the place where he'd grown up, and all the people present there would have known him from his childhood. And he asks for the scroll, and he reads the words of the prophet Isaiah. And then he hands the scroll back to the synagogue attendant. And everybody is waiting. What will this new prophet, whom we've known since childhood, have to say? And how does Christ begin his public preaching? What are his first words? He says, "Today is this scripture fulfilled in your ear, in your sight." Today, that is where Christ begins his public preaching. The desert fathers of Egypt used to make the same point. They would say, there is a voice which speaks to every one of us right up to the moment of our death. And this voice says to us, today. So then, what is the kairos, the moment of opportunity that we Orthodox are facing today in a postmodern era, in a society that not only in the West, but in traditional Orthodox countries, such as Greece, is growing increasingly secular? Let us start our reflections today by thinking about the nature of the Church, about the Church as paradox. In the 2nd century writing, The Shepherd, written by Hermas, there is a double vision of the Church. First of all, he sees the Church as an old woman, dignified and very beautiful, but of great age. And he is told she was created before all things, and because of her the world was framed. That is the first vision he has of the Church. And then secondly, he sees the Church as an uncompleted tower to which fresh stones are constantly being added. So there we have two aspects of the Church. The first vision of the Church as an old woman expresses and reflects the eternity of the divine realm. We think of the Church as the bride of Christ, perfect, sinless, unchanging. And we Orthodox are fond of emphasizing this aspect of the Church. We just heard David make a reference to a radio program in America called Ancient Faith. Not a title that I particularly like, but still, I suppose I'm an ancient person, if you wish to think in those terms. And yes, we are proud as Orthodox that our faith is ancient. We think of ourselves as the Church of Holy Tradition, as heirs to a rich inheritance. We see the Church, the Orthodox Church, as being in direct continuity from the age of the Apostles and the Martyrs, from the epoch of the Fathers and the ecumenical councils, heirs to the Christian Empire of Byzantium. And so often, when we bear witness in the West, what we say to Western Christians is, "We are your past." Here the West might legitimately reply, "We are your future," which leads me to respond, "I hope not." Yet this is only part of the Orthodox situation. We should allow also for the second vision that Hermas looked at, the uncompleted tower. The Church is essentially involved in history, in a world of change and conflict. Throughout the 2,000 years of Orthodox Church history, conservatism is constantly modified by change, and change is constantly impinging upon conservatism. And that is precisely the peculiar fascination of these 2,000 years. So then, bearing in mind Hermas' double vision of the Church, we could sum up this paradox of the Church on earth in two phrases. The first is a phrase that I take from the Russian Orthodox theologian Father George Florovsky. Adapting Plato, he says that the Church is the living image of eternity in time. And in that definition of the Church, the living image of eternity in time, we should give equal emphasis to, on the one side, the word eternity, and on the other side, to the word time. There's also a second phrase that Father George Florovsky uses, as also do other Orthodox writers such as Father John Meyendorff, and that is living tradition. Tradition, that is to say, is not simply a protective, conservative principle, but it is primarily a principle of growth and regeneration. Holy tradition is not just a collection of texts and documents composed long ago, but it is a lived experience, here and now, today. The Church, as the community of holy tradition, has its face turned both to the past and to the future. It's interesting that the Russian theologian Vladimir Lossky defines tradition as the life of the Holy Spirit in the Church. Tradition is not merely something given from the past, static, complete. It is an ongoing life. And exactly the Holy Spirit is associated with dynamic images such as wind and fire. Father George Florovsky says of tradition that it is the critical spirit of the Church. Critical. We do not simply accept the past, we relive the past. So then, thinking of the Orthodox Church in the 21st century, let us hold before our minds this idea of the Church as both old and new. I think of a famous phrase in the Confessions of St. Augustine, where he says to God, "Sero te amavi, pulchritudo tam antiqua et tam nova." Too late have I loved you, beauty so ancient and yet so young. So ancient and yet so young, antiqua et nova. That is the kind of self-image that I would wish us Orthodox to have as we embark on the second decade of the 21st century. Now, to appreciate the present kairos, to attempt an educated guess about the future, we need to look also at the past. The history of Orthodoxy in the century that has recently been completed, the 20th century, was largely determined by two decisive events occurring within 5 years of each other. The first of these events was the Russian Revolution of 1918, the October Revolution. This was the cause of a fundamental and for many a catastrophic change in the situation of the Church within the Russian Empire. Before the Russian Revolution, the Orthodox Church had a secure place under a Christian emperor. The Church played a central role in all aspects of the national life. It enjoyed economic support from the state. It had a privileged position in education. With the Bolshevik Revolution, all this was brutally abolished. The state, so far from favoring the Church, adopted an attitude of militant atheism. The Church lost all its financial subsidies, and not only that, it was disendowed. All its bank accounts were seized. All its land was taken over. Church and state were separated. Church and education were separated. There was a massive closure of places of worship, of monasteries, of theological schools, countless martyrs, and communism after the Second World War was then extended to the rest of Eastern Europe, to Serbia, Romania, Bulgaria, among other countries. The persecution in the post-war period of Christianity was less savage than it had been in Russia in the 20s and 30s. Yet nonetheless it was an oppressive reality. Let us recall that 85% of Orthodox Christians during the period following the Second World War for 40 years lived under an atheist regime. So that's the first event that shaped orthodoxy from an external point of view in the 20th century. And then the second event that I have in mind is the Asia Minor disaster of 1922. You will remember that Greece, following the First World War, following the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire, thought that the moment of opportunity had come for them to recover the areas in Asia Minor that had once been largely Greek. So they embarked on an invasion of Turkey, an ill-advised invasion which ended in disaster. And as a result of that, 1923, by the Treaty of Lausanne, there was an exchange of populations, what we today would call ethnic cleansing. The Greeks of Asia Minor, who in most cases had been there for very many centuries, they were not recent emigrants, and most of them spoke Turkish, and many of them indeed didn't speak Greek. But if you were an Orthodox Christian, you were deemed to be Greek, and so you were expelled from Asia Minor, from the places where you and your family had lived for centuries. You lost everything. You had to march on foot to the nearest point on the coast, where you were herded into boats and taken over to Greece. That affected about 1.5 million of people. Hundreds of thousands seem to have died on the way. There was no mercy shown to old people or to young children. In this way, the ecumenical patriarchate lost most of its flock in Turkey. The Christians in Constantinople itself were exempt. So ancient Christian centers dating back to New Testament times, Ephesus, Smyrna, Thyatira, among others, were rendered desolate. Greece at that time had, I suppose, about 6 million people, and they had to absorb, at one moment, 1.5 million refugees, equivalent to 1/4 of the population. How would we do in Great Britain today if overnight we had to receive 15 million homeless and destitute people? Because we have a population of about 60 million. That gives you some idea of the enormity of the task facing the Greek people at that moment. on the whole, the Greek government coped very well. The number of Turks, that is to say Muslims, living in Greece who were transferred to Turkey was much smaller, probably not more than 500,000. And of course the population of Turkey was much larger. So for the Turkish people, the event was also traumatic, but less formidable than it was for the Greeks. So these two events, the Russian Revolution and the Asia Minor disaster, alter the outward face of orthodoxy in far-reaching ways. From one point of view, both of them were, for the Orthodox, disasters. But a disaster can also be an opportunity. And one of the effects of those two events has been the emigration of huge numbers of Orthodox to the West, to areas that are not traditional Orthodox countries. An extensive uprooting. And that's what I shall be speaking about this afternoon. So, bearing in mind those two events, what is our situation as Orthodox in traditional Orthodox countries at this moment? And what kind of a future do we face? Now, I'll not be speaking of the non-Chalcedonians, of the Copts, the Ethiopians, the Syrian and Indian Orthodox and the Armenians. I'll only be speaking of the, let us call them, Byzantine Orthodox. We are found today in three different situations, so far as the traditional Orthodox countries go. First, we have the four ancient patriarchates: Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem in the Eastern Mediterranean. Here, we Orthodox exist as a small minority in a predominantly Muslim environment. Yes, in the Patriarchate of Antioch, that's to say in Lebanon and Syria, we are a fairly substantial minority, but nonetheless the Mohammedans are the great majority. And on the whole, in these four ancient patriarchates, we find ourselves today faced by an increasingly aggressive Islam. Under the Ottoman Empire, the Muslim authorities were far more tolerant of Christians than they are today. The situation has grown much more difficult, and that is happening year by year. For example, and this affects the Copts chiefly, but also the Greek Orthodox in Alexandria, the Egyptian government is growing far less tolerant now. You might say, well, dwelling side by side with Muslims, there are many possibilities for a Muslim Orthodox dialogue. Well, that is not on the whole happening, at any rate locally, in the Eastern Mediterranean. The Muslim Orthodox dialogue is a luxury that we are able to indulge in here in the West. But the people living on the spot don't have so many opportunities. Now, the Orthodox, in a predominantly Muslim environment, are in general simply aiming at survival, hanging on as best they can, attempting to keep going. There is little prospect of any expansion or creative development at the moment in these ancient Christian centres. On the contrary, there is a general tendency for us to be losing ground in these countries. For example, Constantinople, the seat of the Ecumenical Patriarchate. As I mentioned just now, the Christians in the city of Constantinople, today Istanbul, under the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923, were exempt from the transfer of populations. I suppose at the beginning of the 20th century, the Christians amounted to about a third of the population in Constantinople, which perhaps had 750,000 people at that time, and there were about 250,000 Christians in Constantinople, most of them Greek Orthodox. Now, today, Istanbul has, 12 million or so. It has grown enormously. There are all kinds of settlements of people living in huts without any proper facilities of water or sanitation on the edges of Constantinople. And how many Christians are there in Constantinople? Orthodox Christians, there are probably between 3,000 and 5,000 permanent residents, and a less clear number of Greeks and others, Orthodox Christians, who are in Turkey temporarily with jobs there. So now, instead of being 1/3 of the population of Istanbul, the Greek Orthodox community is a tiny minority. There was, in September 1955, a very ugly anti-Christian riot in which 2/3 of the Orthodox churches in Constantinople were sacked, and great damage was done in the Christian orphanages to the children. And as a result of this riot, which had been carefully planned, this was followed by a massive emigration of Greeks from the city. They no longer felt safe, and many of them were deported by force. People who'd lived, as I say, for centuries there and had all their possessions, they were forced to leave simply with one suitcase, which they could carry, but they were not allowed to take anything else, and the equivalent, I think, of £18. So they lost their homes, their bank accounts, their jobs, everything. The Orthodox Theological Seminary of Halki was closed in 1973. So the Patriarchate no longer had any centre for training future candidates for the priesthood. And to give you some impression of the situation of the Orthodox community in the 1980s, I remember the experience of one of the Greek bishops at Constantinople, Metropolitan Maximus of Stavroupolis, who had been the scholarchis, the head of the school of Halki. His parents were both in Greece, and his mother was dying. He, of course, was a Turkish citizen, and he asked for a visa to go to Greece. It was refused by the Turkish authorities. So his mother died without him having the opportunity to see her. The year later, his father was dying. Once more he applied for a visa. Once more he was told no. So he could not go to see his parents who were dying. That may give you some impression of the conditions in which Orthodox Christians were living. In the last 20 years, however, in Constantinople, there has been a slight improvement. The present ecumenical patriarch, Bartholomew, is allowed to travel freely to the West, and he often does so. His predecessor, Patriarch Demetrius, hardly ever travelled abroad. During his patriarchate, presumably he was afraid that if he did so, he would be refused readmission to Constantinople. He would just have been told, "You stay in Greece, we don't want you." The bishops can also travel freely, unlike Metropolitan Maximus, wanting to visit his parents. The Patriarchate in Constantinople is able to organize congresses and other meetings. So there is a great deal more freedom. The buildings of the Patriarchate, much of them were burnt down in 1940 or thereabouts, an accidental fire. But for many decades, planning permission was refused for them to rebuild. But then again, in the 1980s, they were allowed to rebuild the central building of the Patriarchate, which greatly improved their conditions. But the School of Halki still remains closed. Some Turkish officials make encouraging statements that it may be reopened, but nothing has happened so far. And so the Patriarchate has no centre to train its clergy, and it suffers from a great shortage of personnel. It's difficult to maintain a full staff of clergy and the Holy Synod of 12 bishops if you've only got a home base of about 3,000 Christians. In fact, Orthodox come from abroad and help in the Patriarchate, but they are not granted work permits by the Turkish authorities. They have to come with a tourist visa, which only lasts 3 months. Then they can leave, go for a few days to Greece, and come back again and continue. And the Turks let them do this, though they must realize they're not tourists. But the refusal of work permits is a fairly settled policy of the Turkish authorities. The Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew said to me one day when I was visiting there, "Yes, our position is easier, but all the concessions that have been made to us could be withdrawn overnight by the Turkish government. We have no guarantees of security. We could be told tomorrow, pack your bags and go, and there's nothing we could do about it." In the 19th century, if the Ottoman Empire had tried to do that, then a country like Britain would have stopped them and would have gone to war to prevent any such persecution of Christians. But we know that in the 21st century, while there will be protests from the Western governments, they will not in the end be willing to do anything. That is the reality. So the future in Constantinople is uncertain. In Alexandria and Egypt generally, there are very few Greek Orthodox Christians. Most Christians are Copts. There's been a lot of pressure there, and I don't see any improvement. And there's been large-scale emigration. So far as the Patriarchate of Alexandria goes, it has, however, jurisdiction over the whole of Africa, not just Egypt. And elsewhere there has been major expansion, and there's been the development of an African Orthodox movement in Kenya and Uganda and Tanzania, which is growing and is quite dynamic. So it's not all gloomy. Antioch has, of course, suffered. The Patriarch of Antioch doesn't actually live at Antioch, which is inside Turkey. He lives in Damascus and has for many centuries. But here the Christians have suffered a good deal from the troubles in the Lebanon in the 1980s, and they are suffering now severely from the civil war in Syria. It is interesting to note that dictators like Assad in Syria or Saddam in Iraq have been, on the whole, quite friendly towards the Christians. They may be loathsome tyrants, but they have treated the Christian communities with considerable justice. This is often overlooked. Iraq, of course, the Christians there belong mainly either to the so-called Monophysite Church that doesn't accept Chalcedon, or to the so-called Nestorian Church, the Church of the East, the Assyrian Church. And they have suffered very severely since the invasion of Iraq. The ill-advised actions, if I may be a little controversial, the ill-advised actions of Bush, Bomber Bush, and Blair, Bomber Blair, in Iraq have had the effect of destroying Christian communities that existed without interruption from the first century. Blair now, no doubt in full sincerity, assumes the role of a Christian philanthropist, but his rule was not helpful to the Christians of the Near East, and we should recognize that our intervention by Britain as well as America in Iraq has largely destroyed the Christians there. It's all very well to invade a country and execute a tyrant, but then if you leave the country in chaos, you are highly responsible. I remember when the invasion of Iraq first took place, I was visiting the United States, and I was questioned about my attitude to the invasion of Iraq, and by an Orthodox audience, and I said I was very much against this, that you don't solve the internal problems of different countries by invading them. And my audience were astonished. They were all thinking, it's marvelous, wonderful crusade. Here we are liberating people from an evil tyrant, but look what's happened in Iraq in practice. And I think now many of my audience on that occasion will be less enthusiastic about what was done there. And I think we should bear that in mind over Syria. Supporting the so-called freedom fighters, the insurgents, is not necessarily going to bring peace and justice to Syria. So yes, the dictators were not so severe to Christians. And if in these countries like Syria or Egypt, if they are replaced by militant Islamic regimes, the status of the Christians is going to grow much worse. So we should, I think, take that quite seriously. What about Jerusalem? That's unique in the Orthodox world. It's governed by a monastic community. There's an interesting contrast between the Greek monastic brotherhood of the Holy Sepulchre and the Arab faithful. Not one, I think, of the bishops is an Arab Christian, but nearly all the faithful are. In 1900, about 95% of the Christians in Palestine would have been Orthodox. Today, only 40% of the Christians in Palestine are Orthodox. Great numbers of them have become Latin Catholics, or Melkite Uniates, or Protestants. We have lost over half our flock in Palestine, and much of that has been due to proselytism by Western Christians against the Orthodox. Fortunately, the Anglicans do not proselytize the Orthodox. They, in Jerusalem, at any rate since the beginning of the 20th century, have played an honourable and supportive role towards the Orthodox. But that would not be true of other Protestant groups. So, I'm afraid, looking at the four ancient patriarchates, we have to recognize they are all facing a difficult situation. They certainly need our prayers. Now, coming to the second situation of the Orthodox, in the traditional Orthodox lands, we have Greece. And this is the only part of the world where the Orthodox constitute a great majority of the population, never subject to communism. Perhaps we should put Cyprus in the same category. Now, in Greece, there is still a close association between the church and the nation, between the church and the state. The state still pays the Orthodox clergy, though their salaries last year were halved because of the dire economic crisis in Greece. But it wasn't only the Orthodox clergy who suffered. My friends who teach in universities in Greece, they also have lost half their salary. Now just imagine, those of you who are in employment, what would you do if overnight you were told your salary was going to be cut by 50%? How would you pay your mortgages, for example? So that's very difficult. Incidentally, though I said the state pays the Orthodox clergy, in fact, in Greece, the state has confiscated nearly all the church lands in the 19th century. And so what the state is doing when it pays the Orthodox clergy is compensation for all the land that they seized from the church. It's worth remembering that a body such as the Church of England in this land has never suffered disendowment. It's never had its land and investments taken from it. So it's just compensation rather than a kindly, generous payment from the government. And yes, the seminaries, the different theological schools, these two are still being maintained by the state. They're part of the general educational system. But though the Church-State alliance is still close in Greece, it is now becoming weaker. The last census in Greece, in which people were asked about their church membership, was in 1951. And at that time, only 121 persons in the whole of Greece said they were atheists. The vast majority said they were Orthodox. And those 121 people were quite courageous, because by saying that they were atheists, in the eyes of most of their fellow Greeks, they would have been renouncing their Greek identity by making such an admission, because it would have been assumed then, and it's still assumed by most Greeks today, that if you are Greek, then you are a member of the Orthodox Church. Your Orthodox identity is part of your national identity. I recall having lunch once with a Greek dentist in Jerusalem some years ago, and I was also with a friend of mine, likewise English, who was a Roman Catholic. And the Greek dentist said to us, "You have both betrayed your nation." "Why?" he said. "You," pointing to my friend, "you shouldn't be a Roman Catholic. If you're English, you should be Anglican. And you shouldn't be Orthodox, you should be Anglican." "Why?" he said, "I personally am an atheist. But of course, because I'm Greek, I'm a member of the Orthodox Church." Incidentally, the meat was very tough, so perhaps that was a way of getting trade as a dentist. There was a census in Russia not long ago. I can't remember the details, but significantly more people said they were members of the Orthodox Church than said they believed in God. So this attitude that being Orthodox is not really a matter of personal faith, but a matter of national identity, this still continues. I remember my teacher, Anglican priest, Father Kallistow, saying that when he entered Athens at the end of the war in October 1944, he said, "For the first time in my life, I felt that I was in a Christian city." If you went to Athens today, I don't think you would have that impression. You would find it very like any other capital city in Europe. So the Church-State alliance is growing weaker. In the 1980s, civil marriage was introduced, and abortion under certain conditions was legalized. In the 2000s, there was a great dispute about identity cards, tautetites. The leader of the church at that time, Archbishop Christodoulos, took the view that the identity card should specify your religious membership. The government took the line that it should simply record external details sufficient to identify you, but not questions of personal belief. Now, I myself took the view of the government that if, for example, you are a Jehovah's Witness and you were involved in a car crash in rural Greece, the police, of course, the first thing they do is to look at your identity card. "Oh," they would say, and the police in nearly all countries are pretty conservative. "Oh," they would say, "you are not Orthodox, you're Jehovah's Witness." And immediately that would create a certain prejudice against you. So I think it was good not to include details of religious membership. But the then Archbishop, Christodoulos, vigorously defended the inclusion of identity. and he got together a referendum. Well, he didn't get a majority, but he got more than 2 million signatures of people who wanted to continue religious identity. So he may have lost, but you still see the power of the church. It is said that church attendance is falling in Greece, but I wouldn't exaggerate here. An Anglican priest friend of mine who was in Athens not long ago said to me when he went to church in one of the Orthodox parish churches there, he said, if I got that number of people in church on a Sunday, I would wonder what had hit me. That you would find in the churches of Athens, even though they have 2 liturgies usually on Sunday, and 1 or 2 churches they even have 3, and you would get 500 or more people for each service. But still, we can't be complacent. However, in the 20th century, there has been a revival of monasticism in Greece. There are many more nuns, perhaps 10 times as many nuns today in Greece as there were at the beginning of the 20th century. And among men's monasticism, there's been a revival since the 1970s on the holy mountain of Athos. And this revival has spread to the United States and Canada. In the Greek Archdiocese in North America, a monk from Athos, Father Ephraim, has within a decade opened more than 16 monasteries there in North America. So what is the future in Greece? Hitherto, Orthodoxy has been part of Greek national identity, but in the years to come it will become a matter of choice, of personal commitment. Perhaps that's not a bad thing. We shall expect to see a smaller church, less wealthy, but a church perhaps more vibrant and more alive. What about the former communist lands? And here I must be brief, time is marching on. Since 1988 to 89, especially in the former Soviet Union, there's been an impressive renewal of ecclesial structures. 1988 to 9 in the Soviet Union, Russia and Ukraine together, there were about 7,000 churches open. Today there are well over 20,000 places of worship, a threefold increase. In 1989, there were, in Russia and Ukraine, no more than 16 or 18 monastic houses. Today, there are more than 700 monasteries, and many of them are quite large. For example, I visited Divyevo, associated with St. Seraphim, and in the monastery there, reopened in the early 1990s, well, when I was there, there were 100 nuns and 200 novices. How many Western monasteries have those sort of numbers of novices, I wonder? I'm told the number of nuns and novices today is about 400. The church under communism was identified with the opposition, and that made it attractive to the younger generation. The church-state alliance has been greatly strengthened under the present Patriarch Kirill and Putin. I'm not myself entirely happy about that. But we have to remember that despite this renewal, the number of regular churchgoers in Russia is probably not more than 5% of the population. The churches may be packed, but let us not be under illusions here. Will the renewal, the revival, continue in Russia and elsewhere in the former communist countries such as Romania. Orthodoxy has survived militant atheism. It has shown a remarkable faithfulness in the face of persecution. Will it stand equally firm in the face of liberal secularism? May not a cynical tolerance prove more corrosive than open opposition? I think that applies not only to Russia and Ukraine, but probably also to Romania, but others can speak more about that who are present here. I recall the words of Origen. Times of peace are favourable to Satan, for they rob Christ of his martyrs and the Church of her glory.